Welcome to Narrative Machines, a theory podcast that explores memetics, myth, and propaganda. How our narratives define the limits of our political and personal identity. How they can be controlled. How this era may be consigned to myth just as it was defined by it. Previous drafts of these ideas were published in 2017 in Narrative Machines, Mythos Media, in 2020 in Masks, Bowie and Artists of Artifice, Intellect, University of Chicago, and in various now-defunct web publications. It is presented here in audio format for the first time with additional reflections and editorial. For more of the author's work in various mediums and formats, visit jamescurcio.com. You can also find more podcasts and articles about RPGs and collective storytelling at modernmythology.net. Episode 6. Literary Suicide. Masks Case Study 2. Yukio Mishima.
When Adolf Hitler filled the registration from the Mannerheim in Vienna's 20th district in 1910, he confidently listed his profession as artist. 3 years later, when he came to Munich, he still referred to himself as an academic painter and artist. As a young man, he told his close friends he would be a great artist someday. Adolf Hitler, the unknown artist.
To die for an idea is stupid, people say. Ideas aren't real. Certainly the suicide bomber or kamikaze pilot has been convinced of the reality of a fiction. We look away in discomfort or snub our noses at such fanatics. Rightly so. They've been duped. They were sold a unicorn and paid for it with flesh, blood, and mortar, and not all of it was theirs to sacrifice. There's another side to this extremist posture, however, where all ideas, images, and poses are reduced to empty entertainment. The result is apathy and vulgar nihilism. As a culture, we don't recognize the reality of fiction, though we are utterly swept up in the compulsions of our narratives, while at the same time unwilling to commit entirely to anything with an act greater than a tweet, even for the things that we think are of utmost importance. It's easier than challenging and possibly facing death as the repercussion of our actions. Certainly easier than using our death for artistic purpose. How literally should we take Nietzsche when he wrote, "Of all that is written, I love only what a person has written with his own blood"? Maybe this sense of disengagement and apathy is analogous to the future that Yukio Mishima saw for his dying empire. A future so bereft of virtue that the only thing he could do in response was shove a blade through his innards. Surely, some poetic license is being employed here, but we do know how central aesthetic was to his final act. Perhaps he hoped that his suicide could then effect a final transformation. Writer into warrior, thinker into actor. But this transformation is only properly a ritual when it resonates with a culture, when those ripples reach outwards across the years, transforming entire civilizations. He knew the power of a martyr. This was not Yukio Mishima's fate. He was a man in so many ways out of step with his time, considered by many a relic and reactionary. And this narrative of the transformation of poet into warrior was ultimately his final literary act. To mix metaphors, if a man can become a metaphor, he became the final gasp of a dying mythology, a Japan that had already long since slipped into the history books, if it ever really existed at all. By the time of his death, Mishima was a celebrated author, though sales had been slipping for some time. Widely considered a genius, even criticisms often referred to his skill. Take, for instance, a 1953 issue of Asahi Shimbun, featuring a picture of Mishima dressed ostentatiously as ever, with the caption, "Creepy and cocky, not easy to like, but a kind of genius." It wasn't just because of his craftsmanship with the pen. Mishima faced a conflict between the word and reality, and as he saw it, when it came down to it, he wouldn't back down. It was an unyielding, obsessive commitment to the narrative he had built that made him a gifted writer and eventually guided the blade that killed him. A gruesome detail of his autopsy demonstrates this point. He performed his death ritual to the stringent standards of Seppuku. No one could accuse him of shoddy research. There are many accounts of the day of his death. Henry Scott Stokes, in The Life and Death of Yukio Mishima, is amongst the best at conveying the cinematic quality of what transpired. Stokes recounts Mishima meeting with 4 of his students and their attempt to take General Mashita hostage at the Ichigaya base of the Jiatai. First, they barricaded themselves in his office and fought off several attempts on the part of confused, unarmed officers to assess the situation and make them stop. The officers couldn't seem to believe their sincerity and shouted things such as, "Stop this play acting," despite the fact that the general was gagged and bound to a chair, or that Mishima was waving a sword around. Indeed, Mishima's playing soldier had always had something of the theatrical to it. Even though they were allowed military access, he was a celebrity. Most must have considered it an affectation. This calls to mind Baudrillard's thought experiment mentioned in a previous episode, about an art project that is a staged robbery. Even those present at the time had a hard time distinguishing fiction from reality. But the sword the Tatenokai brought with them was a real 17th century blade, and wickedly sharp. The blood was real. Still, it seems more like performance art gone wrong than a serious coup d'etat. Mishima fumbled his way through the script, shouting from a balcony at jeering soldiers who could barely hear him over the roar of helicopters. The entire incident betrayed a sense of tragicomic performance, right up to the first thrust of knife and swing of sword, meant to decapitate Mishima, instead striking painfully on the back. His final line, "I don't think they heard me." Reality simply refused to comply with Mishima and his lieutenant's designs. For the author's part, however, there is one thing we can be absolutely certain of: his sincerity. Many years before, Mishima wrote, "I cannot believe in Western sincerity because it is invisible. But in feudal times, we believed that sincerity resided in the entrails, and if we needed to show our sincerity, we had to cut our bellies and take out our visible sincerity." There's an ironically poetic element to Mishima's suicide, misguided as it was. A poem written in blood, employing an extreme kind of rhetorical rationalization and justification. Planned in advance, and yet on the night before, he wrote in his journal, "Human life is limited, but I would like to live forever." One must ask, as a writer, did he not recognize that this act would turn everything he had previously written into a kind of suicide note? Or was that the plan? We must balance an embodied outward myth with our disembodied interior life. A shadow, an echo, or perhaps a black hole. An aberration that is only known by the way it distorts all that wanders too near. The 0 point of death threatens to nullify all meaning in a moment. To an extent, maybe we can cheat death through great art. But at what cost? From the vantage point of history, it matters little if we die tomorrow or in 100 years. At the point of death, our vantage point is no more. Time is reduced to that n-dimensional space, like the event horizon. Without an observer to situate a narrative, how can we even speak of time? Forward or backward, relative to what? The same might be said for the paradox between essence and existence, or more prosaically, the asymptotic relationship of soul and body. Mishima recognized this paradox and writes about it in many ways both oblique and direct. For instance, this passage in Sun and Steel.
Let us picture a single healthy apple. The apple was not called into existence by words, nor is it possible that the core should be completely visible from the outside. Thus, at the heart of the apple, shut up within the flesh of the fruit, lurks the core in its wan darkness, tremblingly anxious to find some way to measure itself that it is a perfect apple. The apple certainly exists, but to the core, this existence as yet seems inadequate. If words cannot endorse it, then the only way to endorse it is with the eyes. Indeed, for the core, the only sure mode of existence is to exist and to see at the same time. There is only one way of solving this contradiction. It is for a knife to be plunged deep into the apple so that it is split open and the core is exposed to the light. Yet then, the existence of the cut apple falls to pieces. The core of the apple sacrifices existence for the sake of seeing.
As it turns out, Mishima himself was the apple. It is clear that he was sympathetic to the central idea presented by Sartre in Being and Nothingness, that existence precedes essence. Being is ungrounded. In his 4-volume Sea of Fertility, Mishima takes it a step further, borrowing from the Hosso Buddhist theory of consciousness only, which affirms that all experience is subjective and that existence cannot be verified. Mishima gave a twist of his own to the teaching. As only consciousness existed, there was no telling reality from illusion. A life is self-contained, an endless surface, like a Mobius strip. Nothing wakes up in the end. No final reckoning. No heart to measure on the scales. Meditate on emptiness for an entire artistic career. But how can you represent nothing? Appearance is a deception, and the closest we get to reality. This is what makes the mask the perfect metaphor for emptiness. The mask is the void's masquerade as substance, of whatever is truly exterior to our experience, the absolute outside. We are by all necessity deaf and blind. Nothing can escape this paradox. A voice crying out that is only heard when the mask, its double, mimics that ephemeral gesture. The body is a vase full of empty space, said Mishima. In Sun and Steel, this is presented as a self-imposed nominalism of the body, an anti-metaphysic. In his 1966 performance of Patriotism, we see an attempt to reify the aesthetic as the ethic, as manifest. Patriotism, considered in a particular and somewhat peculiar sense. Nathan says this of Mishima's conception of patriotism. It is what Mishima soon would begin to equate with what he called the essence of the Japanese spirit, and to define as fanatic, his choice of words, devotion to ideals which transcend rationality. This very special notion of patriotism is therefore very like, if not identical, to religious faith. The bridge between the political, literary, and personal is clear through this almost Kierkegaardian leap. In the epilogue of Stokes' biography, he conjectures that the Neo-Confucian philosophy of Yomegaku is central to Mishima's final act. This may be so. In conversation with a Zen master, this philosophy was summarized simply. Yomegaku is very close to Zen. Knowledge is action. That's it, as they say. How can they be at once unified in an act? We know Mishima's ultimate solution by striking at that essence, making it real and nullifying it at the same instant. Thankfully, it is not the only one. Often considered a final testament to his work, Deleuze's short essays on a life written shortly before his death in 1995 exposes some of these invisible threads and provides one of many possible alternate visions of the unity of immanence and transcendence.
The life of the individual gives way to an impersonal and yet singular life that releases a pure event freed from the accidents of internal and external life, that is, from the subjectivity and objectivity of what happens, a homo tantum with whom everyone empathizes and who attains a sort of beatitude. It is a haxeity no longer of individuation, but of singularization, a life of pure immanence, neutral, beyond good and evil, for it was only the subject that incarnated it in the midst of things that made it good or bad. The life of such individuality fades away in favor of the singular life immanent to a man who no longer has a name though he can be mistaken for no other. A singular essence, a life. But the relation of the transcendental field to consciousness is only a conceptual one. Consciousness becomes a fact only when a subject is produced at the same time as its object, both being outside the field and appearing as transcendence. The transcendent is not the transcendental. Were it not for consciousness, the transcendental field would be defined as a pure plane of immanence, because it eludes all transcendence of the subject and of the object. Absolute immanence is in itself. It is not in something to something. It does not depend on an object or belong to a subject.
Nothing should be considered outside our view. The seeming opposites of artifice and the sacred can be counterchanged. The alchemical negredo enters into this process of transformation. From the outside, all that bridges the gap between life and death is the myth, now freed of its tethers. Our lives are a work in progress, a quick sketch that'll one day go forgotten, gradually overwritten like a palimpsest. According to Foucault, this is the nature of an original, existential anxiety that permeates the formation of a modern self, at least in the West.
What death unmasks was never more than a mask. To discover the grin of the skeleton, one need only lift off something that was neither beauty nor truth, but only a plaster and tinsel face. From the vain mask of the corpse, the same smile persists. But when the madman laughs, he already laughs with the laugh of death. The lunatic, anticipating the macabre, has disarmed it. The substitution of the theme of madness for that of death does not mark a break, but rather a torsion within the same anxiety. What is at question is still the nothingness of existence, but this nothingness is no longer considered an external, final form, both threat and conclusion. It's experienced from within as the continuous and constant form of existence.
Deleuze's immanence seems almost identical to Foucault's conception of the revelation of death. We might consider it the positive and negative form, not unlike the Ein, Ein Sof, and Ein Sof Hour of Kabbalists. Mishima seemed challenged by the conflict between the positive and negative forms of immanence, such as in The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. For Mishima, art served as death's mask. I would contend that this is instrumental in regarding both his work and his death. Some may still see an act of seppuku as beyond moral consideration, but it is increasingly infrequent that it is seen as an act of transcendence, let alone an affirmation of eternal principles. In any event, it was Hiroaka's absolute fixation upon this narrative that demanded Mishima's head be cut off. Yukio Mishima as a symbol, an implied double, standing in the way of transcendence. This is the more troubling dimension to Mishima's ritual. It was a brutal imposition of idea upon the real. Of the different takes on Mishima's suicide, political, a lover's pact, a work of art, we should see all the above in some measure because they are all of a piece. The romanticism of his younger years, already rife with bloody-minded undercurrent, expressed itself outwardly in politics, a theatre with real blades and real death, an attempt at reconciling fiction and reality, which is truly where the romantic impulse originates. Writing was the first compensation, a compulsion driven by some need to find equilibrium. This sort of fixation in an artist always goes beyond mere vocation, a source of both pride and shame. He seemed to increasingly look down on it as his need to somehow enter a world forever cut off from him. Mishima also wrote of this compulsion in the retrospective gallery show staged shortly before his death. What I have written departs from me, never nourishing my void, and becomes nothing but a relentless whip, lashing me on. Yet I still have no way to survive, but to keep on writing one line, one more line, one more line. All romantics need their ideal, and for Mishima it took many forms, but fixed his gaze on the emperor. That is to say, the ideal which the emperor represented. Mishima was certainly well aware enough of this distinction to get himself into a small amount of trouble speaking against the literal Hirohito. The broad strokes of this ideology did not originate with Mishima. There isn't room for a thorough analysis of the rootedness of Mishima's romanticism in pre-industrial Japanese history, but needless to say, this history plays an explicit role. More recently, the imperial way gave a theistic bent to Japanese nationalism and had been quite popular before the war. It lent to the idea of the emperor as the literally living embodiment of Japan past and present. A paradigm of moral excellence all should follow. It worked to make people insensitive to the hurts imposed on others by wanton aggressiveness and self-righteousness, just as its American counterpart had done. This was a view still held by many who lived through the war, though the transition afterwards was remarkably fast, all things considered. What is distinct about Mishima's reaction was likely the same as what distinguishes his work, for better and worse. As Nathan speculated, Mishima's means of transfiguring rather than dispelling his nihilism encourages a somewhat covert explanation of his politics, and maybe there is some echo of Baudrillard's speculation. Romanticism is its first great manifestation. It, along with the Enlightenment's revolution, corresponds to the destruction of the order of appearances. According to Baudrillard, from this follows the destruction of meaning, surrealism and Dada, and then an aesthetic form, dandyism, and finally a metaphysical one, in the form of terrorism. In exploring what we called accomplished nihilism, Gianni Vattimo wrote, "Once the real world has been recognized as possessing the structure of a fable, the fable could then be said to acquire ancient metaphysical dignity, the glory of the real world." By a similar logic, Mishima's abandonment of pen for sword demanded a revised version of patriotism be acted out in this theatre of the real. Mishima saw pen and sword as dual poles, based on the feudal ideal of Bunburyodo. This is expanded upon in Sun and Steel, the embracing of a dual polarity within the self and the acceptance of contradiction and collision. Such was my own blend of art and action. By positioning these as opposite forces, which must be in opposition, he created a literary frame that demanded action be taken. I've often heard the glib motto, "The pen and the sword join in a single path," he said. But in truth, they can join only at the moment of death.
Everything is metamorphosed into its opposite to perpetuate itself in its expurgated form. All the powers, all the institutions speak of themselves through denial in order to attempt, by simulating death, to escape their real death throes.
Here again, Baudrillard is speaking broadly of society, and yet its resonance in regard to Mishima's personal life is undeniable. The simulation would be metamorphosed, overturned through a ritual enactment. It bears considering that nationalistic rituals tend to be strikingly similar to religious rites, arranging people in relation to the metaphysical principle through the core myth of the centralized identity. At the simplest level, this expresses itself in forms such as 100 million with one spirit. But it was Jonathan Nathan's thesis that Mishima's metaphysical and ethical principles were rooted in an aesthetic one. Mishima's dandyism, such as it was from a very early age fixated on the erotism of death. This underlying logic seems to run through much of Mishima's fiction, that the embodiment of the highest virtue was an aestheticized death. To Mishima, there seems no distinction between the two, as both represented a vision. The most obvious example being the image of St. Sebastian shot through with arrows, which he claims, by dissembling the truth through fiction in Confessions of a Mask, as the dawning of his sexuality. The fantasies of his childhood never stopped, they just became more elaborate. We can leap from this to his mythology of the emperor as the external embodiment of his anti-metaphysic without skipping a beat. And so we may find an early hint here of what is both ambiguous and yet perplexingly literary about the course of his life, and especially the way it ended. Masks and fictional characters are alike in the manner that a relative lack of complexity renders them coherent. An endnote provided in a chapter entitled History in Simulacra and Simulation becomes incredibly illuminating when placed in this context.
Fascism itself, the mystery of its appearance and of its collective energy, with which no interpretation has been able to come to grips, can already be interpreted as irrational excess of mythic and political referentials. The mad intensification of collective value, blood, race, people, etc. The re-injection of death, of a political aesthetic of death, at a time when the process of the disenchantment of value and of collective values, of the rational secularization and unidimensionalization of all life, of the operationalization of all social and individual life, already makes itself strongly felt in the West. Fascism is a resistance to this, even if it is a profound, irrational, demented resistance. It would not have tapped into this massive energy if it hadn't been a resistance to something much worse. Fascism's cruelty, its terror, is on the level of this other terror that is the confusion of the real and the rational.
The completed manuscript for The Decay of the Angel, the final part of his tetralogy, was found in an envelope on a table, sealed the very morning of his death. Therein, according to Alice Hutton, he
indicts the West with its democratizing, commercializing influence for the erosion of traditional Japanese culture and morality. Just as the democratizing French Revolution, the background of the stage play, hastens the erosion of traditional society and culture in the European West, so too the democratizing revolution in Japan, starting with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, erodes traditional society and culture in Japan with what were, for Mishima, unacceptable results.
We should resist the urge to separate the literary, the psychological, the political, and the personal in seeking a single answer. They blur one into the other. The effect of the Second World War on Japan in general, and Mishima in particular, a reaction to that reaction, cannot be understated in this context. Many Japanese soldiers continued the fight long after the war was officially over, one even continuing to murder Filipinos well into the 1970s. Fanaticism is not unique to Mishima. It does not seem to be the defeat that affected him in the way it did so many others, nor certainly the wanton death and carnage. To the contrary, this he frequently romanticized as a lost opportunity. But rather the inability to any longer tap into the collective mythology that allowed for such fanaticism, formed during the Meiji era, of an emperor descended from the sun goddess, among other things. The characterization of Mishima as reactionary may not be far from the mark, though it must be understood in this specific sense of commitment to a highly aestheticized version of a once relatively common fantasy. This is a unique take on art for art's sake, both personal, the artist shedding art for reality, finally embodying it in literal form, and political, the reification of a sort of metaphysical purity embodied in ultranationalism, emperor's stand-in for this implicate order. A poem in blood, alchemy, and utter, stark madness. There is another piece of context to consider. Theatre of a Western sort was virtually unheard of in pre-war Japan, according to Stokes. An exception is the establishment of the bungakuza, literary theatre, in 1938. It survived the war, taking as its slogan, "Art for art's sake." Many of Mishima's plays were staged there up until 1963, when they suspended his play Yorikobi no Koto during rehearsals on political grounds. He replied in an open letter,
"You set up such safe criteria as art and conceal within yourselves a vague political inclination to the left, dropping the phrase art for art's sake from time to time. Isn't this just hypocrisy and commercialism? I would like you to understand this. There is always a needle in art. There is also poison. You can't suck honey without the poison too.
The following passage from Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols may not have been on Mishima's mind at that moment, but it is certainly relevant to his point.
When the purpose of moral preaching and of improving man has been excluded from art, it still does not follow by any means that art is altogether purposeless, aimless, senseless. In short, la pour la, a worm chewing its own tail. Rather no purpose at all than a moral purpose. That is the talk of mere passion. A psychologist, on the other hand, asks, what does all art do? Does it not praise, glorify, choose, prefer? With all this, it strengthens or weakens certain valuations. Is this merely a moreover? An accident? Something in which the artist's instinct had no share? Or is it not the very presupposition of the artist's ability? Does his basic instinct aim at art, or rather at the sense of art, at life, at a desirability of life? Art is the great stimulus to life. How could one understand it as purposeless, as aimless, as art for art's sake?
How often are our political grievances externalizations of our inner inner struggles, even if projection often mixes and muddles the values? There is no clearer example of this than in the events that led up to Yukio Mishima's death, but even more so in the rationales applied in justifying it. For instance, the Kirkus review of Jonathan Nathan's biography concludes,
both Nathan's book and a recent similar account by Henry Scott Stokes, The Life and Death of Yukio Mishima, have a certain glossy fin de siècle air, touched with Freudian insights, which suggest at times a Hollywood treatment of a poète maudit. Glamorous Mishima was, but he was also a genius, especially at dissembling.
though no doubt meant in a critical sense. Perhaps Mishima fooled his biographers, and so on. Anything that can be said of him pertains more to his work as an artist, rather than some final truth. Whether in regard to the rationale that fueled building an ultra-nationalist cult, or engaging in such a futile incident. That rationale can only be understood in a literary sense. One imagines Mishima's intention, and in effect, we write his final novel with him as tragicomic protagonist. Why is it of so much importance how Mishima died? Answering this question has become the through line of nearly every posthumous narrative. What did his life amount to? What was its purpose? We simply cannot divest ourselves of literary illusions where Mishima is concerned. As with Bowie, the mask and the man are impossible to truly separate. Writer and professional hypnotist John Ivan Palmer began a search, years after their ritual suicide, to track down Hiroyasu Koga, the man who killed both Mishima and Morita, to answer some of these lingering questions surrounding Mishima's death. Mishima's second, Morita, could not properly perform his deed, botching both dispatching Mishima and in disemboweling himself. Hiroyasu Koga ultimately had to step in and behead them both. In the end, Palmer never reached him directly. This may have been because he didn't ultimately follow the right channels, but it could also be for a more poetic reason. All he got was a phone call, signifying silence.
In Japanese, unlike English, there exists an onomatopoeic sound for absolute silence. You sometimes see it in Japanese comic books, manga, where there are so many words that resemble the sound they denote that special English translators have been hired separately to translate them. The Japanese word for silence is sin, pronounced more or less like sheen, with the sound trailing off at the end. Like whoosh is the sound of a sword cutting through the air, and gurgle is the sound of blood spurting out the neck hole. Sin is the sound afterward, when all is done, the body's removed, everyone gone home, and only the silence remains. Did the silence of those phone calls represent a Zen answer, one each from Hiroyasu Koga, Masayoshi Koga, and Masahiro Ogawa, or did all three calls come from Koga himself? Or was it merely three different wrong numbers in the middle of the night that just happened to be spaced exactly 20 minutes apart, disturbing my sleep by reminding me?
That silence could be the sound of resignation, not blood spurting from a wound, just the whimper of a world sucking sustenance through tubes. As John Ivan Palmer related in an email discussing this article in Exquisite Corpse, no one in Japan seems to want to talk about Mishima any longer, considering him kawateru, nuts. Apparently, the modern narrative on suicide, even in Japan, is not what it was. However, this was no suicide born from common despair. This finale he had long written for himself, rehearsed in Patriotism and hinted as early as his adolescent work. It is the train of thought of a radical, to be sure, but it is most akin to what we associate with the extremism of an artist, born the wrong way round, putting word over flesh, art over life. We are taught to fixate on the final act. In this, we see our teleological, orgasmic obsession, the culmination, finish, or goal, the idealized future, and also the ends used to arrive at that destination. For Mishima, in regard to sex and death, orgasmic obsession seems especially apt. Did he believe he needed to literally die to reveal the meaning of his life? This would be an absurdly rigid literary reading of life. If we accept this reading, we might interpret as follows. He recognized the importance of this question in terms of how a person is remembered, while at the same time completely misunderstanding what the public reaction would be. But the comedy in this tragedy was that his performance meant so little. He killed himself after the soldiers, who were meant to be roused by the speech he made, merely laughed at him. Their laughter must have rung in his ears like the jests of the schoolboys who snidely called him poet, who teased him so mercilessly that he had to hide his aspirations as a writer, or the father who had stringently opposed his son's writing, often tearing up documents when he found them. Later in life, nominated to be a Nobel laureate, and still the punchline of a joke. He spent years weight training, focusing on transforming his body by steps into an idealized image. Still, just the poet. There was nothing to do but die, and that too was a failure. This dramatization should of course be written in the I novel style, sentimental to the extreme, and this raises more questions about his authorial intentions, questions we must raise in regard to all of Mishima's self-mythologization. Consider this quotation from the 17th century Hagakure, a text which Mishima held in very high esteem.
The way of the warrior is death. This means choosing death whenever there is a choice between life and death. It means nothing more than this. It means to see things through, being resolved. Sayings like, to die with your intentions unrealized is to die uselessly, and so on, are from the weak Kyoto, Osaka Bushido. The man who lives on when he has failed in his intention is a coward, is a heartless definition. That to die having failed is to die uselessly, is a mad point of view. This is not a shameful thing. It is the most important thing in the way of the warrior.
Supposing we take his final performance seriously, a success in terms of the mythos of his samurai aesthetic, then we might raise questions in quite a different direction. If art is an act, then what is the greatest act a person can take? Are there any ideas that are so tightly wound into our core that we are willing to die for them? If not, does that make us stronger for carrying out the story past the final chapter when we see that it has come? Or does it simply make us like the actor who, after the final curtain call, stands on the stage and repeats their lines over and over in some delusional hope that the curtain will rise again?
A vision of death, now eternally beyond his reach, majestic, acclaimed, heroic death unfurled its rapture across his brain. And if the world had been provided for just this radiant death, then why shouldn't the world also perish for it?
Mishima was 45 when he died. Bowie was 48 when Outside was released, and how different their real-life trajectories were by that point, despite the unity of their mutual artistic obsessions. When Bowie killed Ziggy Stardust, that doomed messianic Dionysian figure kept coming back. Lazarus just wouldn't stay down. The myth demanded that Ziggy die, but clearly David Jones didn't have to follow suit. This became precisely the opposite sort of alchemy than what Mishima was engaged in, although not if Bowie had become a rock and roll suicide himself at 27, like Hendrix or Joplin, or later, Cobain and Amy Winehouse. The real process from realization to sublimation to actualization took some 3 decades to unfold. In Bowie's words,
"There was a theory that one creates a doppelganger and then imbues that with all your faults and guilts and fears, and then eventually you destroy him, hopefully destroying all your guilt, fear, and paranoia. And I often feel that I was doing that unwittingly, creating an alternative ego that would take on everything that I was insecure about."
By the mid-1990s, one of Bowie's favorite interview topics was ritual sacrifice and the role of the body in art. So thematically, his shared obsessions with Mishima remained very real for him. The conceit of this 1995 album seems to, wittingly or unwittingly, react to a line of thought from Adorno. Behind every work of art lies an uncommitted crime. Bowie asks, what if the crime is the art? Bowie had depicted the Minotaur in a few paintings for a 1994 theme exhibit in London, Minotaur Myths and Legends. But he was a character within the album as well, the killer in his loosely fleshed out Hyperloop. A peripheral figure and yet key to the central concept. Through the sacrifice of the living body, the immortality of art is conferred.
Bowie, together with body part fetishist Damien Hirst, actually contemplated recreating the Minotaur. An anonymous man had offered them his body, after his death of course, and Hirst planned to remove the head and stitch on a bull's head in its place. Bowie schemed to house this new Minotaur in a labyrinth on one of the Greek islands.
This installation piece remains figurative as well as speculative, as Bowie was not the sort to break the fourth wall by actually killing for the sake of art. For all we know, this hypothetical was never meant to be acted on. Or maybe Bowie simply lost interest in the idea. However, before 25th November 1970, for all the extremes of Mishima's nihilistic and then militaristic posturing, in fact, perhaps in part because of them, most of his friends and fans didn't think he was the sort to enact his art in reality, either. Surely they wouldn't have let him and his Tatenokai march into a military base with a sword if they did. We may conclude that Mishima became trapped in his own myth, though that narrative only came about because of his being arrested by it in the first place, like a spider trapped in their own web. Art was a way to extricate himself for a while, but eventually, that wasn't enough. An attempt to strike a relationship with an absolute principle, to inspire the reification of certain romantic ideals through such an act. He ultimately embodied his commitment to that narrative, literally. You can't get more literal than putting a sword through your gut. There's no room for equivocation. There would seem an inversion here. By turning the body to art, the artifice of art is brought into reality. Yet with that stroke, he also forever rewrote himself as a joke for much of mainstream Japanese culture. And it's not one that many found funny. There are enough fascists that glorify that image of him to find much of a joke here, from literary giant to academic footnote. In a conversation with novelist Jun Ishikawa shortly before his death, Mishima said, "I come out on stage determined to make the audience weep, and instead, they burst out laughing." Stokes returns to this in the epilogue, saying that a film of his life should end with a slow fade-out on the soldiers. There is no doubt that there was often something about Mishima that struck at hilarity, even when, or perhaps especially when, he was reaching for the greatest heights of seriousness. This may be the final tragicomic genius of Mishima's life as a work of art. Not the stroke of a sword, but the laughter of the soldiers in the courtyard. You have been listening to Narrative Machines. More work from the author can be found at jamescurcio.com and modernmythology.net. To support the production of works such as this, visit patreon.com/mythosmedia.